And I'm really excited to be here today because I have a wonderful person on the call with me. I'm doing my first stream with a guest. So I'm excited to talk about an exciting project that he's working on. And this is a project about the last American slave ship that was found in America. And it's called the Clotilda. And Ryan Noble, he's an associate professor at Spring Hill College in Mobile, Alabama. And he also serves as the department chair for the communication arts program at Spring Hill. And that happens to be where I went to undergrad. So, yes, Ryan was a former professor of mine. And I'm so excited to see him again and just talk with him. But in another role, he serves as project director for this project focused on the last American slave ship found. And so the project name is From Clotilda to Community, the history of Mobile, Alabama's Africatown. And Ryan, I just want to officially welcome you to my live. And how are you doing?
I'm good, Sid. It's super great to see you again and get to talk to you, and I miss you. And yeah, this is
That's
fun.
awesome. So I'm really excited to dive in about this project that you're working on. And so my first question is, how did this project idea come about and when did it kick off?
Yeah, so it's sort of a multi-strand project. So this particular strand of the project comes off of what was our original project, which was a feature documentary film on the story of the Clotilda, specifically on the story of the people, the 110 enslaved Africans that were brought to Mobile on the Clotilda. So we were telling that historical story, and with my producing partner, Joelle Lewis Billingsley, um, we started developing educational, materials and other media outshoots from that project. We've done lots of conversations, and we're continuing to do that kind of work. Like over the summer, we did a series of conversations online, updating some of the stuff that Joelle had worked on with Mobile in black and white a few years ago, which was her first feature film that she produced. Anyways, Joelle is in the educational field. She's an instructional designer. She's a professor as well. And so this particular project that you're talking about, that we just got the grant from the NEH from, is a 1 week workshop that we will put on next summer, 2 different times, and we bring K-12 educators to Mobile, and we spend a week doing site-specific history, talking about how to teach this kind of history. Obviously, one of the more important aspects of that workshop is the focus that we're going to have on teaching hard history or difficult history. So that's a really important component of this.
Mm-hmm.
The NEH um, portion of it is the site-specific history part of it. But I think we were probably an attractive project because we're tackling this idea of difficult history as well.
Hmm. That's awesome. And thank you for mentioning that. So, yes, that was the recent news that you guys received the grant to hold this workshop. So, that's really interesting. And I definitely plan to follow up on that and keep up to date with all the happenings there. And so, I want a little bit of background of our project. So, for those who don't know, can you explain to people what is Africa Town and what is its significance?
Yeah, awesome. So honestly, I mean, I'm probably a little bit biased, but Africa Town and the story of Africa Town is probably one of the most uniquely apparent stories of the African American experience, because the story is that those 110 Africans who were brought to Mobile from Africa, obviously they experienced the African experience, right, where they
Hmm.
were by and large captured in, raids or wartime activities, or just other means, sometimes kidnapping, whatever it was, where they were captured in Africa, were held prisoners. Most of them were prisoners of war,
Hmm.
and then ultimately were sold to outside entities. And in this case, they were sold to the group that was from Mobile, that took the Clotilda there specifically for the reason of bringing enslaved Africans back. A really quick story on that is they did that because there was part of secession in 1859, 1860, was they wanted to reopen the international slave trade. The international slave trade was illegal in the United States since 1808. And there was a huge labor shortage in the South at that time. And so that's why that was another exacerbating effect of the Civil War, was that not only did they not want to abolish slavery, they wanted to actually expand it. And that, accelerated that sort of secessionist movement as well. So they wanted to prove that you could, the international slave trade was still alive and well. And they were doing it illicitly, illegally. Not a lot of people knew. Enough people knew. It was one of those, like, not a really well kept secret that they were doing it. But anyways, that's how they got here. Those 110 people were then dispersed amongst, about half a dozen different work sites, plantations, whatever you want to call them. Slave camps is really what they were, really. And were enslaved, throughout the Civil War. And then in 1865, of course, they were emancipated with everyone else. So they were only enslaved for 5 years. And after emancipation, there was a lot of them that were still grouped close enough that they could kind of find each other after the Civil War. So after 5 years, a lot of them didn't know where everybody else was. But there ended up to be about between 30 and 35 people that kind of came back together, so to speak, and decided to just form their own community. And they spoke relatively common languages. There's probably 5 or 6 different languages that were spoken amongst the 30 people. But they were, they had a lot in common, right? And so much more in common than other African Americans who were coming out of slavery, because there's so few African American. Most African American slaves at that time, or enslaved people at that time, were multiple generations removed from from Africa, and these people were direct migrants from Africa. And so they built this town. The local people started calling it Africa Town, because it was like, where these groups of Africans, it's literally just some Africans there. And it's super unique because they built a community that they would, carried out a lot of their African traditions. They would plant their crops in sort of traditional African ways, built their shanties in sort of traditional African ways, formed a little mini government in their group, and kind of had a council in the same way that, some of the Yoruba tribes would have had in West Africa. So they really did kind of have this little African village right here just north of Mobile.
That's awesome.
So sort of an astonishing thing. Of course, they also got sucked into Reconstruction and Jim Crow, and you know what I mean? So they were also had to live through that as well. And so that's why I say it's such a uniquely and apparent African American experience, because they, as a group, they started in Africa as just normal people, right? And then went through the whole entire process of what we consider the African American experience, from the Middle Passage to being enslaved, to being sold, to living in enslavement, to being freed, to living through Reconstruction, to living through Jim Crow. You know what I mean? The whole thing is encapsulated in this one group. And that's an astonishing fact, that we actually have that story. And it's the basis of the original Roots, the 1970s series, was that this one character, Kunta Kinte, kind of went through all of those steps, more or less. And that's why they told that fictional story. Well, this is an actual real story where there's people that actually did that whole thing. So it makes it, super unique and interesting and fun to talk about. Sorry.
That's okay. And like, something that comes to me is, I've been following this project since, especially like the Clotilda, after it was discovered, I believe is in last year, correct?
Yeah, well, yeah, there was a whole story about that, but yes, last year was when it was officially officially announced that they had found it. Yeah.
Right. And so a person who was on the Clotilda when it landed in Mobile, and I believe he was the last survivor of the slave trade, Cujo Lewis. And so Cujo Lewis lived in Africa Town, and what was his significance behind his landing in Africa Town, or what will become Africa Town?
Yeah. So honestly, the thing that made him the most unique is that he lived so long. He outlived everyone. He lived until 1935. So there
Wow.
was literally a person who grew up in Africa, went through the slavery experience, still alive in 1935. And there's a lot
Wow.
of people alive today that were alive in 1935.
Right, right.
So he's very contemporary. So he became very well known later in his life. After, during the 1920s, there was a lot of there was a resurgence of African Americans sort of recapturing their roots, I guess, for lack of a better word. There was also obviously a huge white backlash, which is obviously in this era, in the 19-teens and 1920s, lynchings were going up. The KKK was very resurgent. So there was this push and pull between like Africans trying to reestablish their identity as African Americans, and of course, the white backlash of
Right.
trying to just put them down and not let them reestablish any kind of identity. That kind of white plurality wanted to keep African Americans without an identity, to keep them